I've always believed in being ready for anything. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and I figured it was better to be overprepared than caught off guard. That's why, 5 years ago, I decided to build an underground shelter beneath my garage. It wasn't glamorous, just solid concrete walls, shelves stocked with canned food, water barrels, medical supplies, and a generator that could keep the lights on for weeks if needed. To me, it was peace of mind wrapped in reinforced steel. At first, no one knew about it. The entrance was cleverly hidden under a section of removable flooring in the garage, and unless you were looking for it, you'd never know it existed. But secrets don't stay buried forever, especially not in a neighborhood as nosy as mine. Somehow, word got out, and once Patricia, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, HOA, caught wind of it, my quiet little project became public enemy number one. Patricia had a reputation. She ran the HOA like it was her personal kingdom, enforcing rules so petty they bordered on absurd. Want to paint your mailbox blue instead of beige? Not without approval. You don't. Thinking of planting tomatoes in your backyard? Better submit a detailed landscaping plan first. So naturally, when she found out about my shelter, she wasted no time marching up to my front door with her clipboard and her judgmental glare. "We need to talk about this. Addition," she said, dragging out the word addition like it was some kind of crime. Her tone dripped with disapproval, as if I'd installed a nuclear reactor instead of a safe space for emergencies. I tried to explain, it's for hurricanes, floods, power outages, but she cut me off before I could finish. "This isn't about functionality," she snapped. "It's about compliance." Compliance. That was Patricia's favorite word. Everything had to comply with the HOA guidelines, even things that didn't make sense. Like the rule that all holiday decorations must be removed within 72 hours after the event or risk a fine. Or the decree that lawn ornaments can't exceed 18 inches in height. Honestly, sometimes I wondered if she lay awake at night brainstorming new ways to micromanage our lives. Still, I didn't let it bother me too much. What did I care if Patricia thought my shelter was a problem? It wasn't hurting anyone. If anything, it was helping. Me and my family. At least. Plus, I figured she'd forget about it eventually. People like Patricia thrived on drama, but their attention spans were short. Once something newer and shinier came along, she'd move on. But then Hurricane Marisol showed up on the radar, and everything changed. When the weather reports started rolling in, panic spread faster than wildfire. Grocery stores emptied overnight. Gas stations turned into battlegrounds. Everyone scrambled to prepare, but most of them weren't nearly as ready as they should have been. Meanwhile, I felt a strange sense of calm. My shelter was stocked, secure, and waiting. All I had to do was wait out the storm. The HOA called an emergency meeting 2 days before landfall. Of course, Patricia took charge, standing at the front of the room with her weather radio clutched tightly in her hands. "Now more than ever," she announced, "we must maintain order and adhere to community standards." Translation: don't dare park your boat in the driveway or hang tarps without permission, even during a hurricane. As I sat there listening to her lecture, I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Claire nudged me gently. "Don't provoke her," she whispered. Too late for that. I'd already invited a few close friends to join us in the shelter. Friends who understood the importance of preparation and protection. Because while I trusted my shelter to keep us safe from the storm, I wasn't so sure about the people outside it. Hurricane Marisol wasn't just another storm. It was the kind of monster that meteorologists warn about in hushed tones. The kind that makes national headlines and leaves entire cities in ruins. When it hit, it didn't mess around. The winds screamed like banshees, tearing through trees and power lines as if they were made of paper. Rain poured down in sheets, flooding streets within hours. Even inside my sturdy house, the noise was deafening. A constant barrage of howling wind and crashing debris. But beneath the chaos above, my underground shelter felt like a different world. Down there, it was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of the generator provided a steady, comforting background noise, and the soft glow of LED lights gave the space a warm, almost cozy feel. We'd sealed ourselves in just as the worst of the storm arrived, pulling down the heavy metal hatch and locking it securely into place. For the first time in days, I finally allowed myself to breathe. There were 6 of us in total, me, Claire, and 4 close friends who had agreed to ride out the hurricane with us. They weren't just random acquaintances, they were people I trusted completely, people who understood the importance of being prepared for the worst. 2 of them, Jake and Lisa, had experience with survival situations. Another friend, Mike, was calm under pressure and great at problem solving. And then there was Sarah, a nurse whose medical expertise could prove invaluable if anything went wrong. Together, we formed a tight-knit team, ready to face whatever Marisol threw our way. At first, everything seemed fine. We passed the time playing cards, sharing stories, and rationing snacks from the supply shelves. Every now and then, someone would climb the short ladder to peek through the tiny reinforced window near the hatch, checking on the conditions outside. Each update painted the same picture: complete destruction. Trees lay uprooted, roofs had been ripped off houses, and water levels continued to rise. It was hard not to feel guilty knowing we were safe while so many others were suffering. But guilt wouldn't do anyone any good. All we could do was focus on surviving. As the hours dragged on, though, something strange started happening. Around midnight, we heard noises coming from above, loud, insistent pounding that echoed through the shelter. At first, I thought it was debris hitting the garage or maybe even part of the house collapsing. But then came voices. Muffled shouts drifted down through the ceiling, growing louder by the second. Someone was trying to get in. Claire froze, her eyes wide with fear. Who would be out there? She whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the ladder leading to the hatch. Carefully, I cracked it open just enough to peer outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing in my flooded garage, flashlights in hand, were Patricia and 2 other members of the HOA board. Behind them loomed several neighbors, soaked to the bone and looking desperate. "What are you doing here?" I shouted, louder than I intended. Patricia spun around, startled. When she recognized me, her expression shifted from shock to indignation. "This is a community crisis," she declared, pointing her flashlight directly at me. "Your so-called bunker clearly has resources we need." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Had she really come here expecting to barge into my shelter uninvited? Did she think I'd built this thing just so she could swoop in and take over? My mind raced as I tried to process the absurdity of the situation. This wasn't just about supplies. It was about control. Patricia always needed to be in charge, even during a hurricane. "You can't just show up and demand access," I shot back, my voice firm despite the knot forming in my stomach. "This isn't public property." Patricia's lips curled into a sneer. "Oh, really? And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" She gestured to the group behind her, their faces pale and drawn but determined. Some held tools, crowbars, hammers, anything they could use to pry open the hatch. Others simply stared, their eyes hollow with desperation. That's when I realized this wasn't going to end peacefully, not unless I did something drastic. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. I stood frozen for a moment, staring up at Patricia and her ragtag group of neighbors through the narrow gap in the hatch. The sound of rain hammering against the garage roof filled the silence between us, but it did nothing to drown out the weight of what was happening. Here we were, in the middle of one of the worst hurricanes in decades, and instead of banding together as a community, they had come to take what wasn't theirs. Patricia's face twisted into an expression that was equal parts desperation and entitlement. "You can't keep this place to yourself," she snapped, her voice rising above the storm outside. "People are suffering out here. You're hoarding resources while the rest of us risk our lives." Her words dripped with accusation, like I'd intentionally built the shelter just to rub their noses in my preparedness. I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. "This isn't about hoarding," I said firmly. "It's about safety, for me and the people I invited. If I let everyone in, it won't be safe for anyone." Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer to the hatch, shining her flashlight directly into my face. "Invited? Who gave you the right to decide who gets saved and who doesn't?" She gestured wildly to the group behind her. "These are your neighbors. Your asterisk community asterisk. Or have you forgotten that?" Before I could respond, one of the men, Tom, who lived 3 doors down, spoke up. His voice was shaky but laced with anger. "We've got kids out here, man. They're scared, they're hungry, and they don't deserve to suffer because you want to play survivalist hero." He held up a soggy backpack, presumably filled with whatever meager supplies he'd managed to grab before fleeing his own home. What kind of person turns away families in need? The pressure mounted, pressing down on me like the storm raging above. Part of me wanted to argue, to explain that my shelter wasn't some magical solution, that cramming 20-plus people into a space designed for 8 would create more problems than it solved. But the look in their eyes stopped me. They weren't listening. To them, I wasn't a neighbor or even a human being. I was an obstacle standing between them and survival. That's when Jake stepped forward. Quiet until now, he moved silently across the shelter floor and positioned himself near the base of the ladder. In his hands, he held his rifle, a sleek black weapon that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Without saying a word, he clicked the safety off. The metallic sound echoed sharply in the confined space, loud enough for everyone upstairs to hear. "Tell them to back off," Jake said quietly, his tone calm but unyielding. His gaze locked onto mine, and I knew exactly what he meant. This wasn't a bluff. If things escalated further, he was ready to defend us by any means necessary. I swallowed hard, then raised my voice so it carried clearly through the hatch. "Listen carefully," I called out. "You're trespassing on private property. Back off now, or there will be consequences." For a moment, everything went still. Even the storm seemed to pause, holding its breath along with us. Then Patricia laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that grated on my nerves. "Consequences? Really? What are you going to do? Shoot us? This is ridiculous." She turned to the others, gesturing emphatically. "He thinks a few guns will scare us off. Well, let him try. We outnumber him." She wasn't wrong. There were at least 15 of them crowded into my garage, drenched and disheveled, but united in their determination. Against that many, even Jake's rifle might not be enough. Still, I refused to back down. If they thought intimidation would work, they were dead wrong. Behind me, Claire grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Please," she whispered urgently. "Don't make this worse. Can't we find another way?" Her plea hit me harder than I expected. She was right. We couldn't afford to let this escalate further. But giving in wasn't an option either, not when it meant putting everyone in the shelter at risk. I glanced at Jake, silently asking for guidance. He nodded once, his grip tightening on the rifle. "We'll give you one chance," I shouted up through the hatch. "Take what we offer and leave. That's all you're getting." Patricia hesitated, her confidence wavering for the first time. She looked at the others, searching for reassurance, but their faces were blank masks of exhaustion and fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Fine," she spat. "But if anything happens to us out here, it's on you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken threats. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back from the hatch, allowing me to close it again. For now, the standoff was over. But I knew this wasn't the end. The standoff didn't end with Patricia's reluctant agreement. It only shifted into a tense, uneasy truce. Once the hatch was securely closed again, I leaned against the ladder, my heart pounding like a drum. The shelter felt smaller than ever, the air thick with tension and unspoken fears. Everyone inside was quiet, exchanging worried glances as if waiting for the next shoe to drop. Outside, We could still hear muffled voices and the occasional thud of footsteps above us, a reminder that our unwelcome visitors hadn't gone far. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to break in," Jake said firmly, his voice cutting through the silence. He kept his rifle close, his posture rigid and alert. "If they think we're weak, they'll try again." I nodded, though my mind raced with uncertainty. How far were they willing to go? And how far was I prepared to push back? This wasn't some movie where lines were drawn clearly between heroes and villains. These were my neighbors, people I'd waved to on morning commutes, shared small talk with at block parties. Yet now, desperation had turned them into something else entirely. Something unpredictable. Claire broke the silence, her voice trembling but resolute. "What if we give them a little? Just enough to make them leave us alone?" Her suggestion hung in the air, met with mixed reactions. Lisa frowned, shaking her head. "If we start giving things away, they'll keep coming back for more. It's like feeding stray cats. They never stop showing up." But Mike chimed in, his tone measured and thoughtful. "She might be onto something. A token gesture could buy us time. We don't have to empty the shelves. Just show them we're not completely unreasonable." It was a risky move, but it felt like the only option that wouldn't escalate into outright conflict. After a brief discussion, we agreed to send up a box containing bottled water, canned goods, blankets, and a few basic medical supplies. Using the pulley system I'd installed during construction, we carefully hoisted the box upward, making sure it landed safely in the garage without exposing ourselves further. When the box reached the top, there was a moment of eerie silence. Then came Patricia's voice, sharp and impatient. "Is this some kind of joke? This is barely enough to last a day. It's all you're getting." I shouted back, keeping my tone firm despite the knot in my stomach. "Take it and go. There's nothing else for you here." Another pause followed, longer this time. I imagined Patricia standing there, weighing her options. She knew she couldn't force her way in, not with Jake's rifle pointed upward, but pride and desperation made her dangerous. Finally, she muttered something under her breath and signaled for her group to grab the box. As they shuffled away, their footsteps sloshing through the floodwater, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For a while, the shelter stayed eerily quiet. None of us spoke. We simply listened, straining to hear any sign of movement above. The storm continued to rage outside, its fury unabated, but the absence of voices in the garage offered a fragile sense of relief. Still, no one relaxed. Jake remained stationed near the hatch, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. Sarah busied herself checking inventory, counting supplies to ensure we still had enough to last. Lisa paced slowly, muttering about how ridiculous the situation had become. Hours passed, each one feeling longer than the last. At one point, Claire whispered, "Do you think they'll come back?" Her question lingered unanswered because none of us truly knew. Patricia wasn't the type to admit defeat easily, especially when she believed she was in the right. For all we knew, she might rally more people, or worse, find tools to break through the hatch. As dawn approached, exhaustion began to set in. The adrenaline that had kept us sharp was fading, leaving behind raw nerves and frayed tempers. Mike slumped against the wall, rubbing his temples. "This is insane," he muttered. "Who fights over supplies during a hurricane?" "People who are scared," Lisa replied quietly. "Fear makes people do stupid things." Her words stuck with me. Fear had driven those neighbors to invade my property, to demand access to a space they had no claim to. But it had also driven me to arm myself, to draw a line in the sand and defend it fiercely. In a way, we were all victims of the same storm, not just the one outside, but the invisible tempest of panic and survival instinct that had taken hold of everyone. When the first rays of sunlight finally filtered through the tiny window near the hatch, signaling the storm's retreat, I allowed myself a cautious flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But deep down, I knew the real battle was only beginning. When the storm finally broke at dawn, it felt like waking from a nightmare. The winds had calmed to a dull roar, and the rain tapered off into a drizzle that pattered softly against the ground above us. Inside the shelter, the air was heavy with exhaustion, but also a cautious sense of relief. We'd made it through the night, alive, safe, and still in control of our space, but none of us were knave enough to think the danger had passed. As soon as we deemed it safe, I climbed the ladder and cracked open the hatch. The sight that greeted me was surreal. My garage looked like a war zone. Water pooled ankle-deep on the floor, mingling with debris swept in by the floodwaters. Tools and boxes floated aimlessly, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the damp air. Outside, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Trees lay uprooted across streets, power lines sagged dangerously close to the ground, and houses stood battered and broken. It was chaos, but eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood or distant shout from someone assessing the damage. Patricia and her group were nowhere to be seen, though their footprints lingered in the mud around my driveway. I couldn't help but wonder where they'd gone, or what they'd do next. Had last night's standoff scared them off for good, or were they regrouping, plotting their next move? Either way, I knew better than to let my guard down. Not yet. Back inside the shelter, the mood was subdued. Everyone moved slowly, weighed down by fatigue and the enormity of what we'd endured. Claire handed out granola bars and bottled water, urging everyone to eat something even if they weren't hungry. "We need to keep our strength up," she said firmly, though her own voice betrayed traces of weariness. No one argued. Survival instincts kicked in, overriding any protests about appetite or energy levels. Later that morning, we ventured outside cautiously, stepping into the wreckage of our once pristine street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, faces pale and hollow-eyed, some clutching whatever belongings they'd managed to salvage. Conversations were sparse, limited to murmured exchanges about who needed help or which roads were blocked. Most people avoided eye contact with me altogether, a clear sign that word of the previous night's confrontation had spread faster than the storm itself. But not everyone stayed silent. One neighbor, an older man named Mr. Hargrove who lived 2 doors down, approached me hesitantly. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he shuffled awkwardly before speaking. "Look," he began, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. "I just wanted to say, thanks for standing your ground last night." His words caught me off guard. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Before I could stammer out a reply, he continued, his tone softening. "Patricia's always been a bully, you know. She thinks she runs this place because no one ever tells her otherwise. Last night, well, maybe it'll teach her a lesson." He gave a small, rueful smile before walking away, leaving me standing there, stunned. Not long after, another resident, a young mother named Elena, approached me with her son clinging to her leg. Her eyes were red-rimmed, either from crying or lack of sleep. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trying to protect your family, and for sharing what you did. It wasn't much, but it meant a lot to us." Her gratitude hit harder than I expected, stirring up conflicting emotions. Part of me felt proud for doing the right thing, while another part wondered if I should have done more. Still, not everyone was so forgiving. Patricia herself remained conspicuously absent, avoiding me whenever our paths crossed. When I finally saw her later that afternoon, she was directing a group of neighbors clearing fallen branches from the cul-de-sac. Her designer shoes were ruined, caked in mud, and her usually immaculate hair hung limply around her face. She shot me a venomous glare when she noticed me watching, then turned her back without a word. That evening, as we gathered back in the shelter to assess the situation, Jake summed it up best. "This isn't over," he said grimly. "Storms pass, but grudges don't." His warning lingered in the air, a reminder that rebuilding wouldn't just involve fixing roofs and replacing windows. It would mean navigating the fragile, fractured relationships left in the hurricane's wake. In the days that followed Hurricane Marisol, Life on Birchwood Lane became a patchwork of recovery and tension. Emergency crews finally arrived, their bright orange trucks and flashing lights cutting through the gray haze of destruction. Power lines were repaired, roads cleared, and downed trees hauled away. But beneath the surface-level progress, a different kind of storm brewed, one rooted in anger, resentment, and lingering questions about what had happened during those chaotic hours when survival instincts took over. The whispers started almost immediately. Neighbors who hadn't been part of Patricia's raid began piecing together fragments of the story. The standoff at my shelter, the armed defense, the supplies sent up as a compromise. Some people sympathized with me, quietly acknowledging that I'd been within my rights to protect my family and property. Others sided with Patricia, accusing me of selfishness for refusing to open my shelter to everyone. He had room. One neighbor muttered loudly enough for me to hear while standing in line for FEMA aid. Why didn't he share? I tried not to let it get to me, but it wasn't easy. Every glance, every muffled conversation felt loaded with judgment. Even routine interactions, like picking up mail or checking on neighbors, were awkward. People either avoided eye contact or stared openly, unsure whether to thank me or condemn me further. It was exhausting, like walking through a minefield where every step carried the risk of an explosion. Patricia, predictably, wasted no time spinning the narrative in her favor. At an impromptu HOA meeting held outdoors, the community center had flooded. She painted herself as the victim of an unreasonable tyrant, a man who valued his own comfort over the well-being of his neighbors. Her speech was dramatic, filled with phrases like community spirit and shared sacrifice. She even suggested that my actions could have cost lives, though no one actually came forward to support that claim. Her theatrics worked, or at least they swayed some of the more impressionable residents. A few began openly criticizing me, calling me reckless and uncooperative. One woman even went so far as to file a formal complaint with the HOA, demanding that my shelter be inspected for safety violations. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of obsessing over trivial rules, they suddenly cared deeply about safety only when it served their agenda. But not everyone fell for Patricia's act. To my surprise, several neighbors approached me privately to express gratitude or solidarity. Mr. Hargrove stopped by again, this time bringing a thermos of coffee. "Don't let her rattle you," he said with a knowing smile. "She thrives on drama. It's how she stays relevant." Even Alina, the young mother, made a point to thank me once more. "You did what you had to do," she told me softly. And honestly, most of us know it. We're just too scared to say anything out loud. Despite these small moments of support, the strain began to wear on me and on Claire. The constant scrutiny weighed heavily on both of us, turning our quiet evenings into tense discussions about whether staying in Birchwood Lane was worth it. "I don't want to leave because of them," Claire admitted one night, staring out the window at the darkened street. "But I also don't know how much longer I can handle feeling like we're under siege." Then, unexpectedly, something shifted. About a week after the hurricane, Patricia abruptly resigned from her position as HOA president. No official reason was given, but rumors circulated that she'd received backlash, not just from me, but from other board members tired of her domineering ways. Whatever the truth, her departure marked a turning point. Without her rallying cry, the outrage against me slowly fizzled out, replaced by the more pressing concerns of rebuilding lives and homes. As the neighborhood settled into its new normal, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The hurricane had exposed cracks in our community, fault lines of fear, greed, and misplaced priorities that couldn't be patched with plywood or insurance checks. Still, amidst the chaos, there were glimmers of hope. Bonds had formed between unlikely allies and lessons had been learned, even if they weren't spoken aloud. For better or worse, Hurricane Marisol had changed Birchwood Lane forever. And as I looked toward the future, I realized that the real challenge wouldn't be repairing the damage left behind by the storm, but finding a way to coexist with people whose perspectives might never fully align with mine. In the weeks that followed, life on Birchwood Lane began to settle into a fragile kind of normalcy. The wreckage was slowly cleared away, replaced by piles of new lumber and the hum of construction crews working tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost. FEMA trailers dotted the neighborhood like temporary scars, reminders of how close we'd come to losing everything. Yet beneath the surface, tensions lingered, quiet but persistent, like an undercurrent you couldn't see but could feel pulling at your feet. For me, the aftermath wasn't just about repairing my home or restocking my shelter. It was about navigating the complicated web of relationships that now define our community. Some neighbors treated me with cautious respect, acknowledging that I'd stood my ground during one of the worst storms any of us had ever faced. Others continued to view me with suspicion, whispering behind closed doors about how I'd hoarded resources while they struggled. It was impossible to please everyone. And honestly, I stopped trying. Patricia's resignation from the HOA board marked a turning point, though not in the way anyone expected. Without her iron grip, the organization floundered. Meetings became disorganized and poorly attended, and the strict rules she'd enforced so zealously started to loosen. One day, I noticed a neighbor painting their front door bright red, a color that would have earned them a fine before Marisol. No one said a word. It was as if the hurricane had washed away more than just a breeze. It had swept aside years of unnecessary rigidity, leaving room for something softer, less suffocating. Still, Patricia didn't disappear entirely. She kept to herself after resigning, rarely venturing outside except to glare at me from across the street. Her presence was a constant reminder of the standoff, but also of how far we'd come since then. Over time, even her icy stares lost their sting. Maybe she realized she couldn't win this battle, or maybe she simply grew tired of fighting. Either way, her absence from the spotlight created space for others to step forward, including newer voices who wanted to focus on rebuilding rather than retribution. As for my shelter, it remained intact, but its purpose evolved. What had once been a private refuge became a symbol of resilience, both for me and for those who understood why I'd fought so hard to protect it. A few neighbors even approached me to ask advice about creating their own emergency plans. At first, I hesitated, unsure if they were genuinely interested or just looking for another reason to criticize me. But eventually, I relented, sharing tips on stockpiling supplies, reinforcing structures, and staying safe during disasters. It felt strange, almost ironic, to go from being labeled a hoarder to becoming a resource for survival strategies. Life has a funny way of flipping scripts when you least expect it. Claire and I talked often about whether we should stay in Birchwood Lane. The thought of leaving crossed our minds more than once, especially during the tense days immediately following the hurricane. But as the dust settled, literally and figuratively, we found reasons to stay. For all its flaws, this neighborhood was still home. We knew its quirks, its rhythms, its people, the good and the bad alike. And despite everything, there was a sense of belonging here that neither of us was ready to give up. Looking back, Hurricane Marisol taught me lessons I never expected to learn. It showed me the importance of preparation, not just for natural disasters, but for human ones too. It reminded me that fear can bring out the worst in people, but also, sometimes, the best. And it forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, my limits, my values, and the lengths I'd go to protect what mattered most. These days, when I walk past my shelter, I smile, not because it saved my life, but because it changed it. It made me stronger, sharper, more aware of the world around me. And while I hope I never have to face another storm like Marisol, I know I'm ready if I do. Because surviving isn't just about having the right tools or the sturdiest walls. It's about standing firm when the winds howl loudest, refusing to let fear dictate your choices. Birchwood Lane may never be the same again, and neither will I. But maybe that's okay. Sometimes, change is exactly what we need to grow, even if it comes wrapped in thunderclouds and chaos.